Welcome everyone to the Hatching Results Hatching Hour. I'm thrilled to be here and be participating. Today we have for you socially just evidence-based practice, what works in K-12 settings, presented by Dr. Brett Zyromski. I'm really honored to be here and introduce Brett, who has been a good friend for many years. Brett is an associate professor and program chair of the counselor education program at The Ohio State University. His scholarship focuses on how school-based counselors can enhance protective factors and positive childhood experiences for students that have experienced adverse childhood experiences, while at the same time deconstructing the systems that create the need for such interventions. His research also explores the impact of evidence-based interventions in school counseling, evidence-based school counselor education, and evaluation in school counseling. He currently serves as an associate editor for the Professional School Counseling Journal. Dr. Zyromski has published over 35 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters related to school counseling issues, delivered over 150 international, national, regional, and local presentations, and has served as numerous international and state conference keynotes. A research fellow at the University of Massachusetts, at the Ohio State University Center on Education and Training for Employment, Dr. Zyromski is also co-editor of School Counseling Research, Advancing the Professional Evidence Base in 2023, and co-author of Facilitating Evidence-Based Data-Driven School Counseling, a manual for practice in 2016. He co-founded and is co-chair of the annual Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference and has served as co-primary investigator or project manager for over billions worth of federal and state grants. So this is a real honor to have Brett here. I'm thrilled. You're in for a real treat. So enough said from me. I'm Lisa De Gregorio. Feel free to message me if I can do anything for you. I'll be helping to monitor the chat. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brett.
Thanks, Lisa. And we were talking before everybody's joined in about how Lisa and I have known each other for over a decade now in a lot of different kind of roles and as friends. And so it's really, I'm excited to be here and to share kind of around evidence-based, the current status of what we think evidence-based school counseling is and what really works in schools for our kids. And I'm just thrilled to see so many folks here on a Friday during what can be like a lunchtime or a morning time or breakfast time. So I don't take that for granted. You all have a lot of places you could be, a lot of things you could be doing. So thanks for taking some time out for this today. I'm just thrilled that you're here. And I'm looking over at the other screen as I see you all put in all your different roles and the ways that you're working for student success and supporting students. And I just want to thank you for that work on really doing it every single day. One of the great joys of my life is continuing to work with school counselors around the country supporting student success. So one of the things that in the work that I've done also with Hatching Results, you know, we talk about reintroducing ourselves. How do we introduce ourselves? And Lisa just gave an amazing, wonderful introduction of some of the things that I've been fortunate to do over the last 18 years. And also, I think we talk about our whys. And so one of the things I usually talk about in keynotes and other places is a part of my who I am is an educator, and being in my mom's first grade classroom when I was in fourth grade and seeing my grandma who's a teacher, my uncle who's a principal in Michigan, and middle school principal, and my aunt who was a PE teacher at elementary school, and my great grandma was a teacher, and just having really kind of grown up in an educator environment, really seeing how education has changed over the decades and kind of growing and living through that. And so that's kind of the context of what we'll talk about today as we discuss really what works. Because that's what evidence-based practices are supposed to be, is what works. And so a lot of times, and we'll kind of frame this conversation around what we're hearing, what you're hearing, often from administrators and leaders, which is we need to just use evidence-based practices. Give me a list of those. Versus what works. So they're not always the same thing. And so that's kind of where we're going to start our conversation. I want to make sure that I really start with a shout out and a recognition of Dr. Carrie Dimmitt, who, and I'm not sure, let's see, I don't see the recording on my end, Alec, but I'm sure that's headed on your end, so I'm just going to keep going. But Dr. Carrie Dimmitt, who is really a co-collaborator in all the work and has helped build out the Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference. And also Carrie wrote the original book, which we're going to talk about in a second, with Jay Carey and Trish Hatch as authors around. When I say the original book, it was the first book in school counseling to talk about evidence-based practices. It was published in 2007, and it really laid the foundation for what we're talking about today. And the Center for School Counseling, Outcome Research and Evaluation, which is a great resource for school counselors, actually, if you want to Google that, it's the Center for School Counseling, Outcome Research and Evaluation. They had been doing institutes around the country since around 2002, which they were getting school counselors and leaders doing the work. And that kind of morphed into the Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference in 2012. So I just want to thank Carrie for her kind of continued work. So we're going to start with you sharing with me what current words come to mind when you think of evidence-based practices or evidence-based school counseling. And of course, we're going to kind of crowdsource a word cloud. So there's links there on the screen that you can use your phone with. Also, I think that we're going to put a direct link into the chat. I see at least one person is into the Mentimeter already. I'm going to switch sharing my screen. Don't worry. When I switch, you're going to have the same exact directions. So it's not going to mess up your navigation at all as you try to get to the word cloud. But here we are in our Mentimeter. This is commonly used now for interaction, especially on Zoom, but also in the classroom. I see that we got 14, 15, all sorts of folks jumping in. We have about 134 of us in this room. So hopefully we can get that participation up to at least around 50. Makes for a nice, robust answer. And then we'll be able to kind of talk through what it is that we're on the same page around what evidence-based school counseling is. So again, we got about 31 folks in here. Give it another maybe 30 seconds and see if we can get to at least 50 of us. And then we'll figure out what evidence-based school counseling is together. So again, I'm just really appreciative of everyone being in here and engaging. And I'm going to go to the next slide. The next slide is a straightforward question. What words come to mind when you think of evidence-based practice or practices or evidence-based school counseling? And this is just going to create a word cloud for us. So if you're participating and you see things that resonate with you, you can type them in as well. Should give you the opportunity to put in multiple answers. If it doesn't, I apologize for that. You can fix that on the back end, but feel free to put in multiple answers if you wish. But you can kind of see data is at the core of evidence-based practice, data-driven, there's research in there, fidelity, equity, ASCA. That's encouraging that folks are, when they think of evidence-based practices, they think of our national association, the American School Counselor Association. That's great. There's been, for many years, Joe Cook and others would have conversations around where they wanted ASCA to be evidence-based school counseling. They wanted to make sure that we were driving what works for kids. I see second step in there, an evidence-based program. Equitable. I love that people are thinking of equity at the core of this. We're going to talk about that a lot today. So I see equity and equitable. So it's on a lot of people's minds that this needs to be equitable practices. Intention. I love somebody where your mind is at with that. Intention is going to be a huge part of this today. Fidelity, curriculum, collaboration. You don't see that a lot. So I love that a lot of people are thinking about it. Requires collaboration. Excellent. We have 76 folks posting this. I love this. Thank you so much. Preventative. One of the things about prevention, it should be the focus of what we do as counselors in schools and school counseling. You're not personally, I think we are school counselors, so we're educators and counselors. If we lose the educator mindset, the counselor mindset of that, we might as well just be deans of students. And more than that, our students need us to be counselors right now. The mental health crisis, we're going to talk about it in a second. So these are all, I really appreciate this. You see people measurable, student voice. Student voice can definitely drive this work. trusted, meaningful functionality, improved outcomes for sure, multi-tiered. We know from research that multi-tiered practices produce better outcomes than those that are just at a single level. Early intervention, often really, really important. All right, we're going to revisit this again at the end and see what folks think after we've gone through this process together. So let's jump back to our slide deck, which you have the slides as well. The reason that you have the slides is because I like to resource folks. So there may be some of you that enjoy knowing the foundation for all this work. And so you have all of the research articles or all the research that I'm going to be citing in here. There's over 150 articles or something like that that I put in the folders for folks that enjoy those types of things. There's also resources like some other different interventions that you can use and other types of practical resources that we'll talk about as we keep going. So our objectives really are to talk about what often is understood as evidence-based practice versus what we're defining it as evidence-based school counseling in this context. There's a visual on your screen. Even this visual is a little outdated. I would update it. This is a couple years old now. It's mostly accurate, but there are some places that I would already change it. So it's constantly evolving to center student success. That's the important thing about evidence-based school counseling is we're constantly evolving how we use evidence-based practice to center student success. Part of that is acknowledging the context in which this is happening, schools, and the precedent history of how we evaluate and what we evaluate and who gets to decide who evaluates and what instruments we're using, when were those norms and why were instruments used originally and how were they created originally. So if you Google the creation of SAT, for example, you can just take a moment if you've never done that, just Google the creation of SAT, and you'll find that it was created by a white supremacist back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to really illustrate nationalism and the separation of white folks and the supremacy of white folks. And so testing has a racist history, and we've only been really working on that over the last few decades to make sure that the instrumentation and assessment is just. And so that's an important acknowledgement to make as well, among other things. And then how do we look at our own work in schools so that we're choosing socially just things that really support student success and address the root issues, which are often system and adult issues, and not just perpetuating a deficit lens on our students. So I'm going to talk a little bit quickly. Feel free if you have questions or want me to go deeper into something, you can throw it into the chat. No guarantees we have time for it, but if at all possible, we will go on to unpack anything you want to unpack. Lisa's also tracking that for us, and if we don't answer it here, I'm happy to answer things with like a question and answer later via like, on like a Word document or something like that, a Google Doc. So contextually, just historically, again, in 2007, this book was published. Thankfully, the title kind of says it all. Evidence-based school counseling, knew exactly what it was about. And the 3 phases of evidence-based school counseling came out of medical model. So it's important context. The medical model is where evidence-based practice began. And the medical model definition, which isn't listed on this slide, was basically what is the problem? And then what do we know works? And an important piece of that second step in the medical model is to the best of our professional opinion. So if there's no research, so the first thing that we're asked to do is look at the research and look at the like evidence-based practices. But in the original medical model, it was if there's not anything known about this, what's the best professional opinion? And then the third is if you're going to try something, you got to know if it's working. So what's the evaluation? So those are the 3 steps of evidence-based practice: problem identification, intervention, evaluation. So the issue when we switched over to evidence-based school counseling is that second piece became manualized intervention. And that's what people started to think of when they thought of evidence-based school counseling or evidence-based practice was what's the manual that we take off the wall? I'm going to use second step. I'm going to use Y-try. I'm going to use blank, blank, blank. And that's going to be the thing that works. Unfortunately, that doesn't work for all kids. And in the context of our schools, it's never going to work. And so we continue to perpetuate a fallacy of approach that's not going to actually work for all of our kids because it makes people feel better. It makes them feel like they're going to do something that works. Now, I'm not saying that they don't all work or they don't work. They do work, and they work for some kids in some situations. And we have a lot of evidence, for example, that student success skills does amazing things and increases outcomes in reading and math. And so there are interventions that absolutely work. And so what we're trying to decide is what's the process by which we choose interventions to address which issues and who's defining that. And so we want to make sure that we're not perpetuating a deficit lens and just focusing on students with our evidence-based practice lens. And I think that's what we unwittingly did with this kind of more narrow definition. So when we think about the narrow definition, I worry about applying your own biases. When I say our own, I mean my own. I mean everyone in education's bias, which often is we have an attendance problem. What's going on with our parents and families? They can't get their kids here. And then there's a deficit lens automatically. Or what's going on with our kids? They can't come to school. What's wrong with them? And then there's a deficit lens automatically. And so we have a way of kind of centering a certain way of thinking, which can perpetuate oppression and also limit our ability to support students in the complexity of what's actually going on. So it's an old paradigm, but we're in this current context. So we don't want to approach it in this like fixed students approach. We often are being asked to only use evidence-based practices, like I mentioned earlier. A lot of our school counselors, I'll get emails, can you help me prove the value of what I do because we're about to be cut? And so a lot of times people refer to evidence-based school counseling to like show the value of the job, show the impact of the work, and impact data outcomes. We want you to increase reading. We want you to increase math. It can do all these things. So it's not that it can't do all these things. It's just not all that it is. There's so much more. And so we really want to think about evidence-based school counseling as a process. And I'm going to get to that in a second. And if any of these resonated with you as far as the pressures that you're under to show the value of your job or only use evidence-based practices, feel free to jump into the chat and let us know. So Carrie, in a keynote in New York City a few years ago for the Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference, asked, how do we develop an evidence-based school counseling model that takes into consideration the true complexity and ever-changing nature of our schools and our profession, and the multiple contexts and ecological systems in which the students live and in which we live. And so that's kind of what we've been trying to articulate since then. So our most recent kind of visual is around acknowledging the intersectionality of social contexts and identities that our students hold and our teachers hold and that we hold. And then really centering the ecological and contextual factors of the work instead of student deficits. And what I mean by that is, we'll get to a little bit later, is that socially just practices don't require students to be responsible for the oppression and the systems that they did not create and that they do not have the ability to manipulate to support their own success. And so we are going to talk about this in the sense of we're looking at evidence-based school counseling usually addresses systems first, and then we support students as well. So it's a multiple-pronged approach to what we would possibly call deconstructing or reconstructing systems while investing in students' liberation. And what we mean by that is we give students the things that they need to navigate and overcome the things that they do not control that create barriers for their success. But at the same time, we try to address those systems. Those things can be politics, communities, teachers, school counselors, administrators. Like, we can be barriers. And so how do we really look at this to overcome it? So again, what we're going to do, and just so that I see Nicole asking again, I said, what we try to see this as is deconstructing and reconstructing systems so that they are no longer barriers to student success while investing in the liberation of our students. And that we're trying to, when we talk about liberation, it comes all the way back from those people that read like free air in college. And this is, there's an amazing theory. We have a few amazing school counseling theories that I did not have when I was in my program, and advocating student within environment is one of them. So, Matthew Lemberger Truelove, Dr. Lemberger Truelove helped co-create the advocating student within environment theory, and it really centers the work and centers kind of that philosophy that I just mentioned. So we really have to talk about foundations before we talk about evidence-based school counseling. We want to keep a track on time. So it can be jarring to think of education as colonization, but it perpetuates and continues today. Book burning, not serving all of our students. Oh, I misspelled a word in there. Sorry about that. Not serving all of our students, automatically oppressing LGBTQ plus students, the underrepresentation of, and there's going to have other examples of this, but the underrepresentation of Black students in gifted and talented programs, and the overrepresentation of Black students in special ed. Access to AP and IB are inequitable across the country. STEM access is inequitable across the country. So these things, graduation disparities are perpetuated by race. By the way, there's recent research that shows that Black students are served at a lower rate by school counselors than other students. We have fewer touch points. So we literally are tracking that with school counselors, and we perpetuate oppression unknowingly. And that's a bias that we can kind of grow through. So we also, I kind of already talked about how standardized test scores were created. They tend to have been created with and perpetuate oppression in some way. And so again, that research by Van Est et al. In 2023 showed that school counselors often underserve Black students as well. This isn't by accident. I think it's really important to say that this isn't by accident, that education has been used to assimilate folks since the creation of our country. And there was a Supreme Court decision in 1973. Sorry, that date is wrong. I'm going to change it. It was 1973, I'm pretty sure. San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. This Supreme Court decision if you've heard the Supreme Court decision, put it in the chat, because I want to give you 1,000 made up points for having heard about this already. But this court decision, basically Rodriguez's family brought the court, the suit against San Antonio Independent School Districts because Rodriguez says, I want a equal education. I'm looking across San Antonio Independent School District, and there are schools over there that are really well funded by the tax brackets, and there's all sorts of resources at the schools. My school does not have that. And so they sued. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. What happened was, and this was a decision, was called one of the 10 worst Supreme Court decisions in the history of our country, was the Supreme Court decided for San Antonio along party lines and basically said, you are not required to have an equal education. You are only required to have an education. And so what that perpetuated, I see Tamika's face, what that perpetuated was the zip code funding for schools that keeps going today, which is how we continue to oppress and create inequitable education in the United States. So this is, when I say it's not by accident, I'm saying that this was codified into the way that our education system works in the United States across this country. And so things are not by accident. And so when we say, well, this school doesn't have any support, especially during the pandemic, you saw that. Well, that's not by accident. We tried to change that, and the Supreme Court said no. And so now we have this in our country that we all are dealing with all the time as we think about how to liberate our students. So when I say liberate our students, this is part of what we're talking about. So the content that I'm talking about at the bottom of this slide, I try to create a link for you. I've created a bibliography for folks that enjoy that type of thing, of resources and articles. And these are linked to Google Drives for you to have. And again, you can share and use them however you want. If you're an instructor somewhere, you can use everything that if I have it, it's yours. If there's content of these slides that you like, just cite where you got it from this presentation, but feel free to use them to continue to advocate for change. So when we talk about education as colonization, many Black and brown scholars and researchers, as well as other folks of diverse identities, have been speaking to this for decades. Some of those folks in our field, Dr. Julia Bryant, Dr. Beard, Dr. Edmund Mersinga, Dr. Griffin, Dr. Aiva, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Love, Dr. Bettina Love, has an amazing 2 books, Dr. Love, Dr. Renee Mays. There's a lot of amazing people doing this work. And so I want to make sure that I acknowledge upon whose shoulders I am standing to share this. So we know that zero tolerance schools don't work, that discipline just perpetuates school to prison pipelines. That the discrimination of Black, Asian, and Spanish-speaking students continues and has been a foundation of education for over 100 years, 150 years. And often social emotional learning has been used to control students of color rather than invest in the things that actually have been shown to be assets and strengths for those populations. So this is the context in which I'm talking today. The other context that's important to talk about is that suicide is the second leading cause of death for adolescents, that Middle school kids have increased their suicide rates by 300% in a decade between 2007 and 17. About 40% of students in schools in the United States report feeling depressed. 10% have attempted suicide. 1 in 5 seriously consider attempting suicide. That all this has been worse. And then I gave you a link to the Youth Truth Survey there at the bottom, in which about 300,000 students during the pandemic said that mental health issues was the #1 barrier to their success in school. Hopefully, if you aren't aware of adverse child experiences and social determinants of health, you can Google them. Their adverse child experience has been called the greatest health crisis in the United States. World Health Organization uses it or names it as a primary issue for them. The original 1998 study of adverse child experiences identified 10 components inside the home. But since that time, since 1998, it's expanded beyond the home into the lived environment, looking at all sorts of areas around the ecology. And the Philadelphia ACEs research showed that racism is an ACE as well. So a lot, talked about a lot. I'll pause. Any questions about our context at this point? We've got a pretty serious environment in which we're working. So what do we do about that? Is really the question. What do we do around all these things? And I'll pause for 30 seconds in case anyone has any questions that they want clarification about something that I've gone through rather quickly over the last 10 minutes. All right, so I hope that means you're with me. So one of the things that I realize or have come to realize is that as a white cisgender male, I can easily perpetuate oppression if I remain anonymous or if I don't speak out and speak up and then start taking action. So that was and is something that continues to be at the center of how we work, how I work. Evidence-based practice is a little bit in a parallel way, can easily perpetuate oppression. And what I mean by that is if we have knee-jerk reactions to students that are not reading at grade level by 3rd grade, or attendance is very low, or our multilingual learners are struggling, or academically, or fill in the blank around what's going on at your school. If we automatically are in a meeting and someone says, these students are, those students are, they just need blank, 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 then we can easily perpetuate the oppression by creating a deficit lens and centering students as the problem. It is likely not a student issue, it is likely a system-created issue that the students are struggling with. And Dr. Bruce Perry, one of the original researchers of the ACEs project and an amazing scholar in ACEs, says it's all skill, not will for students. So we just have to retrain students how to navigate the trauma they've experienced. So if we're doing trauma-informed schools to help students, that's an excellent start. But then also if we focus on the assets and strengths that students and their families and their communities bring, then we can especially center their strengths and not deficits. And if we really interrogate the systems, then we don't hold students accountable for the systems that they didn't create. So in order to address the complex systems that we just kind of have been talking about, all these kind of issues that our students are trying to face, our solutions need to be similarly complex. So that navigates how we go through this process, or informs how we go through this process. So this is the updated definition of evidence-based school counseling. In the context of everything I just mentioned, here's how we've defined it. Dr. Dimmitt and I have defined it after working on this for probably 14, 15 years. The first step is an exploration of the nature of the situation we hope to impact. How can we learn about what's going on? This is thoughtful and intentional. Somebody wrote in their word cloud, intentionality, and it just made me so happy. 2, what do we know about how best to create change in that situation? We've had folks present at the Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference around how to change policies and politics at the state level in California. That was an amazing presentation. We've had people present from the state of Washington about how things have been changed at the state level by a single school counselor who advocated all the way up the way to change things at the state level. So we have examples of how the nature of the situation we hope to impact is policy or things that are happening at system levels. Well, what do we know works to change system levels? Well, different advocacy, different collaboration. We're not even talking about students. And then how will we know if the change has occurred? So it is definitely moving forward and working to change systems as part of evidence-based school practice, school counseling, evidence-based practices. So if we apply the definition, updated definition, instead of the original definition, we can see that those social numbers of health, the adverse child experiences, the oppressive systems we've talked about, we can attack those with the same lens that we ensure students are successful. Because if we know, for example, we can give a lot of examples, but AP and IB enrollment is an easy one. As a school counselor, one of the things that I would do in the school is ask what the policies are if I was in a high school around AP enrollment or IB enrollment. And if it's not a legal requirement, then get rid of it. It was created by the school as a barrier. It's an unnecessary hoop. And the response from teachers will be like, there has to be some rigor. And like, no, you are creating barriers. We can support our student success. And there's been research that's shown when the percentage of students in AP and IB go up, the same percentage of students kind of struggle as before. So if you have 100 students in, let's say 70 are doing great and 30 are struggling. And if you let 200 in, that same 30% are going to struggle. But there's not that concern that teachers are like, the whole system's going to go, like it's not going to be on fire. It's going to be fine. Let more people into AP and IB and then build support and success for them. So that's a small example of how we can use the evidence-based lens. Like what's the problem? AP and IB disproportionality is the issue. How do we change that? We change the system. How do we know when it's changed? AP and IB enrollment should be more equitable. It's not a super complex system. It's really just making sure that we know where to invest in the system change and tracking the results of our efforts. So again, if I'm going too fast, let me know. If you have questions, let me know and make sure we have time to kind of go through some resources. But if the primary focus of our evidence-based school counseling lens is on the intervention only, we're going to miss the larger ecological issues that are creating the problems. We're not going to be able to do the root causes. We're not going to be able to challenge the things that are actually worth addressing in the first place. And one of the important things that comes out of this, and one of the things that I did not do when I was school counseling was I did not measure the assets, strengths, and resources of my students and their families. And if we don't do that, then we're not going to be able to increase the success of the students and change the equity and barriers that are in place. So when you think about evidence-based school counseling, I'm hoping you think about it more as opportunities. We have opportunities to look at the way that prejudice and oppression is playing out in our systems. We have opportunities to address those things directly and watch the effects on student success and celebrate those. We are able to promote mental health of our adults in the school too. Our adults in schools are just students that grew up with ACEs. A lot of times the teachers in our schools have as many ACEs as our kids. And so they just elevate and escalate as they are coming together. And then how can we address root cause, find out what the real root cause is? A lot of times the root cause stops at like the second why. You're supposed to go through 5 whys. What's the root cause of the students' 9th grade struggles? Well, they're not really understanding how to, blank, blank, blank. Oh, okay, let's do this. Like that's not actually root cause. And so when you think about looking at root cause, you want to think systems first, not students first. And so how do we investigate what is really known about the system issues, and then what is known about how to help address those system issues? And then if we're going to assess things, how do we make sure that we're using culturally informed assessments like student voice and other things that really center students into this work? So just a reminder as we go into the next few slides, the nature of the situation we hope to impact, investigate what's known about how to best to create change in that situation, and then thoughtfully assess to determine if the change has occurred. All right, so now we're going to go into it. Step 1, learn. What's the nature of the situation we hope to impact? Dr. Shaoka McCoy, who's amazing, the Dean of College of Education at American University in Washington, D.C., keynoted the Evidence-Based School Counseling Conference a few years ago, and her keynote asked, who gets to define the issue? Because who defines the issue is defining everything else in the process. So one of the beautiful things about student voice is students get to define the issue. They get to start to define what's going on with navigating. Are the data that we're using to define the issue reinforcing existing inequities? Who defines which data is being used and what issues we're uncovering? Are there students in there? Excuse me, how are the data being prioritized? Who's the process served? And anytime you see like a blue underline, it means that it's linked to an article or something that should hopefully help you think about this around evidence-based school counseling or practice. And then as I go through that first phase, do I have a coherent picture of root challenges, ecological, not just student focused, as well as strengths and assets of our students and their families and communities? And am I aware of my own bias? How do I bring this in? What am I bringing into the lens of this? And those folks that are living in Florida and Texas and Ohio and other places, where are the political environments pushing on the priorities and the abilities for students to be successful? And how do I navigate that? Because that's not easy and that is real every single day. So how do we figure out how to do those things? Well, we collect multi-layered data, not just one data point. Anytime, the rule of thumb that when I'm teaching my students now, anytime I do a needs assessment, I do asset mapping. How do I do asset mapping? There are 2 articles linked right there. Dr. Dana Griffin is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. She is probably our national leader in how to do community and asset mapping, and she lays it out in those 2 articles. So if you're like, you keep talking about this asset mapping, that's the instruction manual right there, those 2 articles. Collect systemic and individual level data, not just student data. Yes, I can. Sean's looking for the research on course enrollment preconditions, AP, IB, student success. That research has got to be a decade old because I've been talking about it for a long time. So I have to really go back and search, but we'll find it together. One of my favorite tools, by the way, is Google Scholar. So if you open up Google Scholar and you put in exactly that, then hopefully we get the same outcome, but I'll help look for it too later. So focus on systems and adults in your building first. I know when I was a school counselor, I just had one teacher who loved to teach from the doorway. And so that teacher had the majority of office referrals. And so the office referrals that were happening in our building were really because of a teacher, not because of the students. And so we had to really break down the data trends, who's doing what, where, when, for how long. Do our goals include freedom, dreaming, and home place? If you don't know what that is, I highly recommend you to read that article. It's very important. We're working in schools where more than 50% of our students are students of color, more than 65, 67% of our counselors are white female. For everybody to really invest and know what freedom dreaming is and home place. To collect student voice, there's an approach called Youth Participatory Action Research, YPAR, just answering Stephanie's question in the chat right now. So if you, and I think I might have some examples of this. Participatory action research. At our Myrna, sorry, everybody, I'm just typing this in right here, and I misspelled Natalie's last name, but it'll come up. Those are 2 authors that are really national leaders in student voice in counseling today. Dr. Ian Levy also is a national leader in hip hop and student voice and how to create really having students drive the programming. So if you put in Google Scholar, if you put in Ian Levy's name, if anyone's ever navigated Google Scholar, you can actually choose the scholar and click on their name. So you can just put in Ian Levy and then choose him and look at his Google Scholar list, and you'll see all sorts of resources for youth participatory action research. Freedom, dreaming, and home place are very important as well. Just circling back to that, Dr. Renee Mays has done some incredible work on that lately. And it's centering the culture of our students and making sure that students of color have a place that is free from oppression in the school. And how do we build that place? And so there's pieces of that, even as we're learning around data, that we're kind of prioritizing that liberation of students as we look at the systems. And then are we addressing social determinants of health? There are ways to do that, and I'll give you some ideas here in a second. So what do we know about making change, which is the second step of this? So the first is like learning, learning, learning. You can spend a lot of time in learning because you want to make sure that you're really getting an accurate sense of what's going on. So then what do we know about making change? Well, we know there's a lot of research around a lot of things, but not very many evidence-based practices. And I say not many, there's over 55 or 58, so there's a bunch. However, which have been normed with the students that we're working with. Some have student success skills, other things like that have been normed and worked with very diverse populations over and over again. But things like school success stores, which are being created in Columbus City schools, which are basically places where students can come in, and the school success stores, it may even be called student success stores, I may be misquoting it, but they're basically funded by volunteers and just donations from the communities. And students can come into these stores that are on campus and get clothes and food and resources. And what I've seen them, they're amazing. And what we see is that the social determinants of health that kids are trying to struggle through, they're not solved with the school success stores, but there can be some sort of relief in some ways. And sometimes we see kids come in and they're shopping for dad, for shoes. They're shopping for family members. That's great. Come in, do what you need to do to help address social determinants of health. Restorative practice instead of zero tolerance discipline, we know works. It's really hard for schools to break out of zero tolerance. And if I'm being frank, why? Because they've been in place since Jim Crow laws. So it's been 150 years of zero tolerance. So it takes a little bit to break out. So let's work on that. We want to increase touch points with counselors. Are we making sure that we have a lot of touch points with our school counselors? We want to make sure we're decreasing special ed disproportionality. For someone that's highly involved in special ed, you can Google Scholar Dr. Donna Ford. Dr. Donna Ford for special ed is really the national leader around how to create equity and access to special ed for all students and decrease inequity, especially for Black students. Wraparound services are great, actually. Family engagement, there's a Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center I would encourage you to use if you're looking for family engagement resources. The link's right there. And then Dr. Capria Johnson has created templates for starting to address social determinants of health as school counselors, and I've linked one of her articles. So then we kind of look at, okay, so not all those things are evidence-based practice, but we know they work. So are we looking for a manual or are we looking for what works? And so we want to make sure we're breaking down systems based on what works. And some things are research supported. For example, cross-age peer programming is research supported, but there's no specific program that's evidence-based. So should you not do cross-age peer programming? You should absolutely do it. It works. It's amazing, both for the student that's older and the students that younger. It benefits them tremendously. But there is no prepackaged program that you can just put in and start working. So it's we want to make sure that even if you're doing something that's self-created, it could be working. And so that's where that third piece is evaluation. So I mentioned earlier how the model needs to already be updated. That determine needs little box right here on with this, I don't know what color that would be, kind of an off red, whatever. It also needs to say assets and strengths. Determine the assets and strengths and needs. And so this is obviously evolving even as we keep building it. Some folks just like, tell me what to do. Well, this is an example of what you need to do if you want to just take something. We did a research project and we had a group of doc students who were amazing. Look at all of these evidence-based programs. So if you wanted a manual or a program, these are all evidence-based programs. And which protective factors do they build? So if you move your head, you can see protective factors like empathy, peer intimacy. That just means like your actually real relationship with a peer, doesn't mean like intimacy. Positive students to teacher relationships, positive student to peer relationships, pro-social friends, which means Lisa cares about me as a friend because she cares about me, not because she's trying to get something out of the relationship. That's a pro-social friend. School belonging, resilience, school engagement, school safety. All these are years and years of research to establish them as protective factors. So how do you build them as a school counselor if you want to choose an evidence-based program? Well, you'd start Big Brothers, Big Sisters of America at your school, and you could build a bunch of them based on the empirical research. So when you see a dot in this table, it means that there is empirical research studies that have shown that that particular intervention on the left increases whatever that dot is saying that it does. So student success skills is a school counseling intervention, and there's research that shows it increases school belonging, school engagement, self-efficacy, social emotional support. So we know this is that the evidence is supporting that. So that's how this table is working for those people that are like, give me something. The things to think about though as you choose interventions is who created the program, which populations has been normed on, does it center or support cultural strengths and assets, who defines the success and the measurement of the program. And there are some programs that aren't on here that are excellent that I really like Character Strong, if you have money, is really evolving and becoming an excellent school counseling program. True Goals is an intervention that can be used across grades 4 through 12. We know that it increases motivation and some other things. We've been doing work and research on it. We think it's going to increase hope, which is one of my favorite characteristics and constructs. Any questions about this table before I move on? All right, that's a no. To avoid the trap, I gave this to you because I figured your administrators and others might be saying, all right, you went to this evidence-based school counseling training. Where's the programs? Here are the programs. Avoid the trap, right? Don't jump into the programs. But this is just the resource for you in case you had to do the old way of evidence-based practice. Don't perpetuate the deficit lens. But all of these things have been shown to be tier 1. This is about 5 to 7 years old, this list. So in that time, there's probably doubled this many. We just haven't spent the time to organize them all. But these are examples of things that you can do for drug and violence prevention. Yeah, thanks, Tamika. I really love that chart. If I was to go back, it was quite a few months of project of, a fun project to kind of build it out. We have a similar chart for positive childhood experiences with which buffer ACEs, but protective factors and positive childhood experiences kind of overlap so much that I just did the one chart. But it's linked, by the way. The chart itself is linked to the article, so you could have the whole article and the other chart as well if you go to the link. I Can Problem Solve is a very sorry, I don't mean like old as in like it's been around for a long time. Positive Action has been around for a long time as well. A lot of really good programs in here. Here's your tier 2 program if you were going in this way. Again, I almost didn't put these charts in here. Like I was very tempted to not, because the trap is, oh, great, I'm gonna just use these. We've used Coping Cat, and there's the cat project as well. Coping Cat is one of my favorite things to take because it's really inexpensive on Amazon for anxiety. And as you know, anxiety is being felt by all of our kids right now. I think the anxiety in our schools is, well, the anxiety increased for adults 300% during the pandemic. So our adults increased anxiety 300% in the pandemic. I think students increased by 266% in the pandemic, and anxiety was an issue before the pandemic. So if I want to address something at the tier 1 level, I'd probably take Coping Cat. For the high school is like the cat project. So that's not actually correct. So when it says high school, it says Coping Cat. I think it's called the cat project. But if you go on Amazon, you'll see that it's right there. A deficit lens is when you put the problem on the student as if they created it and if they're responsible for it, and as if they're the ones that are going to solve it, and you put them as the issue. And so you want to switch it around to assets and strengths. Centering whiteness is realizing that the entire school system is built on a white lens. What I mean by that is assimilation happens in schools when we're saying to all students, when you become basically white, you'll have done well. Instead of how can we center your culture? How can we center the way that you learn best? How can we make sure, for example, there's a really great research that I link in here around how SEL around, I don't know if where I have it linked. SEL around fostering cultural pride is a better SEL than like Castle's SEL, for example, because centering cultural pride, for example, centering Black pride will help create success in a system that really wasn't created to support that particular format or measure of success. So it's the realization that we can, inadvertently center the norm of whiteness over every other culture in school and education today. And that's part of the barriers to how people are struggling with learning, because the system isn't built for them. It's built for assimilation to this particular way of learning. There are a lot of educators across America who are doing amazing jobs deconstructing that model and centering and supporting students' joy and success in schools in a way that kind of honors all sorts of different ways of learning. So Tamika, there's a lot of research around, if you want to connect with me, or I can also put it in the link, there's a lot of research around anti-racist SEL. Castle has been coming onto the game a little bit over the last few years with socially just SEL, but there's a guy named Dr. James Comer out of Yale who actually started SEL back in 1965. Dr. Comer was an African-American male professor, and he went out into the schools and took the lowest performing schools, and in 5-10 years they became the highest performing schools. And what Dr. Comer did is he created leadership teams of families, so African-American families, mental health experts, students, teachers, all in the school, and they led the school. Administrators like consulted with them. That was SEL. So you're talking about like cultural pride, family pride, Black pride, mental health support, teacher, student voice. They led the school. That was the center of SEL. And then in 1992, Castle invented SEL. And it moved all those pieces to the outer piece of the circle, and it put all the things in the inner piece of the circle that kids needed to do to be successful. But also, if you did all those things, you'd be still in class. And so lately, it's been moving back out to the other way, where you're centering students, you're centering student voice, you're centering culture, you're centering those things. There's a lot of really cool research on that, probably in the folders, but if not, I'm happy to send that out when we send out the links. Anisha, what I would do is there's some links to the articles in here that I would read and then try to go with those. And we can, that's a whole nother hour we could talk about at another time. That'd be really, really fun to talk about. I think that you should ask Hatching to create an hour around what Anisha said with Dr. Renee Mays and oh my gosh, some other amazing authors that I could, and that Lisa already knows actually, and I'm just blanking on names right now, but you already know these folks too, Lisa. So the last step as we go through is assessing what actually matters. So high stakes tests really measure three things. They measure the education level of the mother, social economic status, and opportunities created by those other two things. And so they're not really very predictive of future success, as predictive as we would want. So hope is a better predictor of future success than SAT, ACT, or GPA. Belonging is a better predictor of school success. Belonging is amazing. If I built a school, I would measure hope and belonging and leave it at that. Because if students have high levels of hope and high levels of belonging, they're going to be successful in life. I want my kids to be holistically successful in life. In other words, they bring joy to their life, they enjoy being in life, and they have enough money to be able to live. And if there's other things, that's fantastic. But hope and belonging would predict that probably better than SAT scores. I think that I love doing these presentations with admins and then giving them the data around testing. It makes me really happy. The last couple of things I'm going to share with you, I've linked a group of assessments for you. There's a link to a hope scale, it's 6 items, an isolation scale, because isolation has increased exponentially in the pandemic, a school belonging scale that you can put into a Google form as well, so you can measure your kids' hope and school belonging. I know Panorama Company also measures belonging. That's an easy thing. There's a list of measures if you click on this link here that will take you to a bunch of measures as well. There's a link that has a bunch of measures here that have been specifically normed and work well with Latino populations. Castle's links, they're not always free, but you can find a bunch of things there. There's some screen instruments from a grant there. The Protective Factors Index is a teacher report for K through 5. Anxiety, of course, anytime you get into mental health, you have to remember the Hatch Amendment. You have to have parent permission when you get into mental health things. The RAND organization, if you open this up, there's a lot of resources there as well. And you can actually click a little thing that says, just give me the free one, please. And then there's also a lot of measures here as well. So when we do pre-posts, I really don't even teach my kids how to create pre-posts based on their interventions as much as I teach them how to create a hope scale, how to create a school belonging scale, how to create those types of scales. And that's what they measure when they're measuring their pre-posts. All right, our last thing, and then Lisa's going to close us out for the day. Now that we've talked, what words come to mind when you think of evidence-based practice or evidence-based school counseling? If you need to get back here again, I'll put this up for 10 seconds, but come on back into my Mentimeter and we'll see what we think about with our evidence-based school counseling one more time. And then we will have Lisa take us home. Same Mentimeter link as before. That's correct. Do you mind putting the direct link in the chat again, Lisa? Do we have that?
Yeah, let me search back for it.
It's probably way at the top.
I know.
Sorry.
Me or Courtney, it's a mad dash. We'll see who can get to it first.
Julian, you need permission for when you assess mental health issues of students or like their religious or spiritual. So if you're going to do like an anxiety scale, you have to have parent permission for that. All right, last slide. What words come to mind now when you think of evidence-based practice or evidence-based school counseling? Justice. Oh, it makes me so happy. Equity. I love it. Hope, interventions, white supremacy. Hopefully not in perpetuating it, hoping against that for sure. Pre-interventions, love that. I love that phrase because you're talking about that thoughtfulness and that being really thoughtful before you get into stage one, which is like, what do we know about this issue? Dismantling an unjust system. Absolutely. You'll see students flourish when we start deconstructing the barriers that are keeping them from success. Student-centered, absolutely. Systems, liberation, love these. Thank you so much. This is so encouraging to me. Holistic, fidelity, assets, collaboration, system evaluation, empathy, families. Thank you, folks. You are resonating with me so much. If we go forward with this, imagine how our schools will change for students and centering students. Well, that is the end of my time here. Lisa, thank you so much for the opportunity and for Hatching for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you all for showing up again on a Friday. I truly do not take your time and engagement for granted. I thank you for taking time out to be here and for everything that you do for kids. Again, as someone who believes in education as liberation, you are the front line of that work. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. And we just have a couple of announcements, and I put the link in to the evaluation. So if you would just take a minute to complete the evaluation for us, if we continue in the slides here. If you liked your time with us today, just so you're aware, Hatching Results has a quarterly kind of Hatching Hour webinar, so you can look back at some of our previous webinars. We do record it. We will be sharing the recording to this one probably next week. So if there's some topics here, feel free to go to our website and you can access previous webinars. And then just so you're aware, if you like virtual learning and virtual opportunities and you find it accessible, please join us. We have our very last virtual event of this school year, the Use of Data Advanced Institute. Don't let advanced throw you off. It really is just kind of going beyond theory and really focused on practical application and application of concepts of actual implementation in your school counseling program. So we have a special offer for you all. If you use the code HRDATA, the cost is just $99. It's regularly $125. So please join us on April 19th. And then we have for you here, we know it's the end of the school year, but if you're interested in opportunities in the next school year, we have a series of cohorts, mini series, workshop series, and also some full day events. So be sure to check that out. And again, I just want to give Brett a round of applause. So thank you for being here. We'll stay on. And again, please complete that evaluation. So thank you and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody. Again, have a wonderful weekend.